There's a way to know the true ego of anyone, no matter how sophisticated their facade, no matter how convincing the image they project. Two simple things reveal everything. And once you learn to identify them, you'll never see people the same way again. Eckhart Tolle has dedicated decades studying the nature of the human ego, and what he discovered about how the ego reveals itself can completely transform how you understand yourself and others. If you've ever wondered why certain people seem so different in public and in private, if you've ever felt that something was off about someone but couldn't quite explain what, if you've ever been surprised by the true character of someone who seemed trustworthy, this video will finally give you the tools to see beyond the masks. But before I reveal these two things, I need to warn you about something important. What I'm about to share isn't a technique for judging others. It's a tool for awareness that serves both to recognize patterns in others and, most importantly, to recognize these same patterns in yourself. Eckhart Tolle teaches something fundamental about the nature of the ego. The ego is the unobserved self. It's how you distinguish yourself from others. It creates your identity from your social status, your job, your possessions, your education, your appearance, your relationships, your personal and family history, your beliefs, and your belonging to political, national, racial, and religious groups. Do you understand this? The ego isn't something bad that needs to be destroyed. It's simply the self that isn't being observed. And when we observe the ego, something magical happens. It starts to lose its power over us. Research in psychology confirms this in fascinating ways. Studies published in 2024 show that ego defense mechanisms operate unconsciously and automatically. We don't even realize when we're protecting our sense of identity. The defense happens before we're even aware that something threatened our ego. Now let me reveal the first thing that exposes the true ego of anyone. The first revelation is how a person reacts when their sense of identity is threatened. Eckhart Tolle describes this powerfully. Defensiveness happens very quickly in human interactions. It's an automatic pattern. You may only recognize it later and say, "That was defensiveness again." These are all the ways the ego tries to protect itself, the ego being the self created by the mind. Observe what happens when you disagree with someone. Observe what happens when you question a belief that a person considers central to their identity. Observe what happens when you point out a mistake or a flaw. The reaction reveals everything. A person with a strong and unobserved ego will react with immediate defensiveness. They'll shut down. They'll attack back. They'll change the subject. They'll devalue your opinion. They'll get irritated or even furious. All of this happens automatically, before they even realize what they're doing. Why does this happen? Because the ego confuses criticism of an idea with criticism of the person's existence. When you question a belief of someone deeply identified with their ego, that person feels as if you're questioning their right to exist. Eckhart Tolle quotes A Course in Miracles in a revealing way. Whenever you become defensive about anything, know that you have identified with an illusion. That's profound. Defensiveness is a sign of identification with something that isn't real. And the stronger the defensiveness, the stronger the identification with the illusion. Research in psychology shows that there are different levels of ego defense mechanisms. The most immature include denial, projection, and rationalization. Studies from 2024 found that people with pathological narcissism predominantly use maladaptive defense mechanisms like devaluation, omnipotence, idealization, and denial incongruent with reality. But caution, I'm not saying that all defensiveness indicates pathological narcissism. We all have egos. We all defend ourselves sometimes. The question is the intensity and the frequency of the defensiveness. A person with developed awareness may also feel the impulse to defend themselves, but they perceive this impulse. They observe the reaction arising, and in that observation, they have a choice. They can choose not to react automatically. Eckhart Tolle explains, as awareness grows, some people begin to think they are getting worse, so to speak, but they are simply becoming more conscious of what has already been there for many years. People frequently ask if they are getting worse because they can still detect dysfunctional or reactive patterns within themselves. It's not that those patterns will simply disappear as consciousness grows. You will just be more aware of them. That's liberating. The goal isn't to never have defensive reactions. The goal is to observe them, and in the observation, they lose their power. So when you want to know the true ego of someone, observe what happens when that person is contradicted, criticized, or challenged. Do they shut down, or do they open up? Do they attack, or do they question? Do they deny, or do they consider? The answer reveals the level of awareness of that person, much more than anything they say about themselves. Now let me reveal the second thing that exposes the true ego. The second revelation is how the person compares themselves to others. Eckhart Tolle teaches, the egoic sense of identity needs conflict, because its sense of separate identity strengthens when fighting against this or that. In your interactions with people, can you detect subtle feelings of superiority or inferiority in relation to them? You are looking at the ego, which lives through comparison. This is a golden key to understanding anyone. Observe how someone talks about other people. Observe if there's a constant need to position themselves as better or worse. Observe if there's a compulsion for comparison. The ego can't exist without comparison. It needs an other to define itself. I'm smarter than him. I'm less attractive than her. I'm more spiritual than them. I'm less successful than those. Each comparison fuels the ego. Each comparison strengthens the illusion of separation. And here's something fascinating that Eckhart Tolle reveals. Both superiority and inferiority are manifestations of the same ego. The person who constantly puts themselves above others and the person who constantly puts themselves below others are both trapped in the same egoic pattern. Research in psychology confirms this. Studies show that grandiose narcissism and vulnerable narcissism are two sides of the same coin. The grandiose narcissist presents themselves as superior, special, deserving of admiration. The vulnerable narcissist presents themselves as a victim, misunderstood, wronged. But both of them are completely identified with their ego. The difference between them is simply the strategy they use to protect their sense of identity. Eckhart Tolle adds another layer to this. Complaining and reactivity are favorite mental patterns through which the ego strengthens itself. For many people, a huge part of their mental emotional activity consists of complaining and reacting against this or that. Complaining is one of the ego's favorite strategies to strengthen itself. Each complaint is a little story that the mind creates and in which you completely believe. So, observe not just direct comparisons, but also complaints. The person who constantly complains is strengthening their ego. They are creating stories where they are the victim and others are the villains. This is also comparison, just disguised. The conscious person can recognize injustices, can identify problems, can point out what needs to change, but they do so without the emotional baggage of the complaint. They do so without strengthening a sense of victimhood. There's a huge difference between saying, "This needs to change," and saying, "This is terrible and I'm the victim of it." The first is conscious observation. The second is ego strengthening. Now that you know these two revelations, let me show you how to apply them in a practical way. First, observe yourself. Before using these tools to understand others, use them to understand yourself. When was the last time you got defensive? What was being threatened? Your intelligence, your kindness, your competence, your spirituality. Eckhart Tolle teaches that observation of the ego is the path to transcending it. The key is your awareness. When awareness deepens, all those patterns that you mentioned will weaken. Our identification with our own ego is the source of all suffering. This is revolutionary. You don't need to fight against your ego. You don't need to destroy it. You just need to observe it. And in the observation, it naturally weakens. Second, observe others with compassion. When you see someone's ego operating, when you see the defensiveness, when you see the comparison, remember that this person is trapped in unconscious patterns. They are not choosing to be this way. They are reacting automatically from conditionings that often come from a long time ago. Research in psychology shows that people with pathological narcissism often develop these patterns as a response to experiences of neglect or emotional rejection in childhood. The false self they created is an attempt to compensate for feelings of inadequacy and obtain validation and admiration from others. This doesn't justify harmful behaviors, but it offers understanding, and understanding allows you to protect yourself without hating. Third, learn to distinguish between ego and essence. Eckhart Tolle makes a crucial distinction. If there is any negativity involved, anger, resentment, irritation, then the ego is present there. If there is no negativity, but there is an underlying field of peace, then this arises from a deeper place that is not the ego. This is a simple and powerful test. When you interact with someone, pay attention to the energetic quality of the interaction. Is there underlying peace, or is there constant tension? Is there openness, or is there closedness? Is there flow, or is there resistance? A person's essence, what they really are beyond the ego, manifests as peace, openness, and presence. The ego manifests as tension, closedness, and reactivity, and you can feel the difference. Your body feels the difference. Your intuition feels the difference. Fourth, understand that the ego is afraid. Why does the ego defend itself so fiercely? Why does it compare itself so compulsively? Because it is afraid of not existing. Eckhart Tolle explains. The word identification comes from the Latin idem, which means same, and facere, which means to make. When I identify with something, I make it the same as me. I invest in it a sense of self, and so it becomes part of my identity. The ego is a collection of identifications, and when any of those identifications is threatened, the ego feels that its own existence is at risk. That's why the reaction is so intense. That's why the defensiveness is so automatic. But here is the liberating truth. You are not your ego. You are the awareness that can observe the ego, and that awareness is indestructible. Fifth, use this knowledge to create more conscious relationships. When you know that someone has a very strong and unobserved ego, you can choose how to interact with that person. You can avoid triggering unnecessary triggers. You can maintain your inner peace, even when the other person's ego is active. You can choose not to fuel conflicts. This doesn't mean being passive or letting yourself be mistreated. It means acting from awareness, instead of reacting from your own ego. Because here is something that Eckhart Tolle makes very clear. When you react to someone's ego with your own ego, you only strengthen both. Two egos in conflict feed each other. The only way to break this cycle is when at least one side operates from awareness instead of the ego. Sixth, recognize that we are all at different stages. No one is completely free from the ego. Even the most advanced spiritual masters still have egoic patterns that arise occasionally. The difference is that they recognize them quickly and do not identify with them. Eckhart Tolle admits this about himself. As awareness grows, you become more aware of patterns that were already there. It's not that you are getting worse, it's that you are seeing more clearly. So when you observe a strong ego in someone, don't judge as if you were superior. That would be your own ego wanting to compare itself. Simply observe, simply understand, and use that understanding to navigate the relationship more consciously. You have just learned the two things that reveal anyone's true ego. This wisdom has been ignored because most people are so identified with their own ego that they cannot see the ego in others without judgment. When you click the super thanks, you become a guardian of this awareness about the nature of the ego. It's not payment, it's positioning. You chose to see beyond the masks. Now I want to leave you with a concrete practice that you can apply immediately. In the next 7 days, do an observation experiment. Every time you feel the urge to defend yourself, pause. Don't repress the impulse, just observe it. Ask yourself, what is being threatened here? What part of my identity feels that it needs protection? And every time you catch yourself comparing yourself to someone, pause again. Observe the comparison. Ask yourself, am I trying to feel superior or inferior? What is my ego trying to gain from this comparison? That simple practice begins to create space between you and your ego. And in that space, awareness grows. And as awareness grows, the automatic patterns weaken. Remember what Eckhart Tolle teaches. The ego is the unobserved self. Simply by observing it, you've already begun to transcend it. You now have a power that most people don't. You can see beyond the masks. You can recognize the ego operating both in others and in yourself. And that recognition is the first step toward liberation. The two things that reveal the true ego of anyone are simple, yet profound. How they react when their sense of identity is threatened. How they compare themselves to others. Defensiveness and comparison. These are the two mirrors that reveal the ego in all its complexity. Use these mirrors with wisdom. Use them first on yourself, and when you use them on others, do it with compassion, knowing that we're all at different stages of this journey of awakening. Eckhart Tolle concludes with a truth that sums it all up. When awareness deepens, all those patterns weaken. The key is your awareness. You don't need to forcefully change anything. You don't need to fight against your ego or the ego of others. You just need to see. See clearly, see with awareness, and in that vision, transformation happens naturally. The masks begin to fall away. The truth begins to emerge, and you discover that behind every ego, both yours and others, exists the same awareness, the same presence, the same essence. That's the most liberating discovery of all. Controversial point. Eckhart Tolle teaches that the ego lives through comparison, and that both superiority and inferiority are manifestations of the same egoic pattern. This means that every time we compare ourselves to someone, we're strengthening our ego. Do you agree or disagree? Comment below. Which of the two revelations resonates most with you? Defensiveness or comparison? I'll be responding to everyone in the first 2 hours.